All right, good morning, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us for another Wednesday webinar as part of the Power of Place Summit. My name is CJ Oberthauser. I'm the Director of Training and Placemaking here at Grow Smart, Rhode Island. And today we're covering historic rehab projects in relation to the state historic tax credit. And I'll let our Executive Director, Scott Wolf, introduce that topic more fully in just a second. Just want to say a few things. First of all, thank you for being here again. We wish we could be with you in person, but we're really grateful to have the Zoom platform to allow more access to our webinars and to our panels. And we will have one of these every Wednesday morning, except for new development next week. We are going to postpone that panel, the new localism, something like that. I forget what the title is.
Localism, all about the new
Right.
localism.
Right. Okay. I didn't screw it up. Good. So we're going to postpone that one. We'll have more information about that at a later date. But other than next Wednesday, we've had one every Wednesday since I think May, and we will continue to until September 25th. And you can check out the full list of webinars on our website. And on September 25th, we're going to have a half-day plenary version of our Power of Place Summit, and that will be virtual. And we're going to feature Scott Spencer of Smart Growth America and the Annie E. Casey Foundation, along with award-winning columnist E.J. Dion of the Washington Post and Brookings Institution. And we've got some other panels and discussions in the works that we'll be announcing shortly. And we'll also be featuring our 2020 award winners with some videos and presentations on that date that we hope you'll stick around for. I want to also take a moment to thank our sponsors, without whom we definitely couldn't be putting on this virtual event. Full speaker bios are available on our website of all of these folks and everyone else who's been part of panels so far. So you can head to our website to check those out. And all of our webinars are also approved for one AICP credit for all of you planners out there that are seeking those. Just head to the AICP website to log those. Should be pretty easy to do. If you have any questions throughout this panel, please feel free at any time to use the Q&A feature here in Zoom, and we will make a huge effort at least to have plenty of time at the end to get to those. And lastly, this is being recorded, so you are going to be able to watch it again in the future if you'd like. And thank you once more for being here. And with that, I'm going to hand it over to Scott.
Thank you very much, CJ. And I want to welcome our dynamic set of panelists, Paul Lothar, Executive Director of the Rhode Island Historic Preservation Commission, Barbara Sokoloff, President of Barbara Sokoloff and Associates, and Hannah Moore, the Chief of Staff of the Executive Office of Commerce, RI. Before I turn the program over to them and then to you folks in the audience for Q&A and dialogue, I wanted to talk a little bit about what the objectives are for our webinar today, and also provide some context for the whole challenge of sustaining historic rehab's momentum in a resource-limited COVID era. As far as objectives, I see three for today at least. One is to give everybody an update on what is the status of historic rehab demand and supply in terms of resources in the state right now, and to help to chart a path forward for sustaining the state's nearly 20-year record of outstanding historic rehab achievement. Actually, it's a longer record than that, but over the last 20 years, the amount of historic rehab has really accelerated in Rhode Island with the advent in 2002 of the state historic tax credit to supplement the federal historic tax credit, which I believe has been in place since the late 1970s. And also we want to explore the best advocacy and coalition building approaches for making more historic rehab resources available. So I would like to spend just a very brief period of time talking about why Grow Smart Rhode Island and a number of our allies believe that promoting historic rehab is so important. It's been probably the signature priority of Grow Smart Rhode Island almost since we started 22 years ago. And there's a number of reasons why we put it at the top of our list. First of all, in a state that doesn't have unlimited strengths and unlimited competitive economic advantages, the incredible and diverse collection of historic buildings and neighborhoods that Rhode Island has is arguably one of our best competitive economic advantages. And shame on us if we don't play to that strength as much as possible. And then secondly, and probably equally important, historic rehab has probably been the best catalyst for community and economic development of any single tool in the state's quiver over the last nearly 2 decades. It's been important as a way to recruit mobile advanced companies and their talent. Virgin Pulse, United Natural Foods are 2 examples that quickly come to mind. It's been an important tool for reinforcing Rhode Island's distinctive brand in the tourism world as a place with charm and beauty and user friendliness. Also, in a state that has so many urban town and village centers, main streets and downtowns, it's been a very strategic tool for revitalizing those places, as well as contributing to expanding transportation options and affordable housing options, which are other key parts of the smart growth agenda. And then there's a couple of additional benefits of historic rehab that are probably not as self-evident as what I've just described. And one of those is cleaning up brownfields, cleaning up contaminated sites. For many of the successful historic rehab projects that have occurred in Rhode Island over the last 2 decades, the developer, the project owner, has had to clean up the area on which the building is sited in order to make the project feasible. Especially our mill buildings in urban waterfronts, they're almost all facing some level of contamination. So that's been a very important fringe benefit of the push for historic rehab in Rhode Island. And then a second benefit that's not maybe on the marquee all the time is reduction in street crime in areas where extensive historic rehab occurs by populating areas more, having more people on the street, and reduction in arson and vandalism. When you have a fully occupied historic building, you're likely to have less vandalism than if you have an underutilized or vacant historic building. So this one approach of historic rehab really advances a lot of the key economic, community development, and quality life goals of Rhode Island and of the smart growth movement. Turning to the current picture, and I'm only going to touch on this briefly because I think Paul and others on the panel will have more detail. But there's clearly a lack of resources right now for historic rehab. The state historic tax credit program is limping along at this point. At least it's still on the books. There was a threat that it was going to sunset. In fact, it was scheduled to sunset a few months ago, but some of our legislative allies and our coalition were successful in getting a 1-year extension of that sunset, and we'll also obviously be pushing for an additional extension in the next session of the General Assembly. But it's a program without any dedicated reliable source of funding at this point, other than some recycling of credits from grandfathered projects that aren't able to complete their work. And so there's a huge waiting list. Last time I checked, 36 projects representing a proposed investment of more than $250 million, that's $1 billion in the Rhode Island economy. At the same time, we've kind of have this ironic situation where Rebuild Rhode Island has become a more user-friendly alternative for incenting historic rehab. And there's been a recent grant round focused on smaller projects, both historic and non-historic, that Hannah's going to talk more about. But, and I think Hannah, again, will elaborate on what I'm about to say, but I think the administration, Commerce RI, is struggling to get the General Assembly to approve additional funding for the Rebuild Rhode Island program. So very little money for the state historic tax credit program, not very promising in the short run for more money for Rebuild Rhode Island. Therefore, it's a struggle for these projects to move forward. Some still are, and I would say there are two ways. This is a dangerous generalization, which my panelists will correct me on. But I say there are two ways they're moving forward. One is, well, certainly a lot of them are using the federal historic tax credit, which is still in place. And then with people like Barbara strategizing and improvising, they're able to pull together enough non-historic tax credit resources to make a go of it. And Barbara will talk more about how some of those projects happen. And then the other way some projects are moving forward is, as many of you probably in the audience know, when the original very robust state historic tax credit program was temporarily put on ice back a number of years ago, projects in the pipeline at that point, and there were many, were grandfathered if they agreed to take a slightly smaller credit. A number of them are still working through the system, even 12 years later, or at least some are. A lot of them have gone through the system. And again, Paul can tell you more about that. Final thing I want to talk about before introducing our panelists is the fact that while we are kind of treading water in terms of resources at the state level for historic rehab, there's at least a prospect of additional federal resources, both for historic rehab and for infill development and non-historic building development near transit stations. There's three specific initiatives I'm aware of that are promising. One is what I would call a federal historic tax credit enhancement bill that actually has found its way into a House-approved infrastructure and transportation program. A second, but whether that goes anywhere in the Senate at this point is uncertain and probably unlikely in the short run. A second is a proposal for a new rehab tax credit for non-historic buildings that are near transit centers, and that's got bipartisan support, but I don't think has moved very far in the legislative process. And then a third promising initiative for historic rehab and community revitalization is a proposal by the National Trust for Historic Preservation and the National Main Street Center to get an additional $100 million in federal funding for state and local Main Street organizations. And that could be especially important for Rhode Island because Rhode Island is one of the relatively few states in the country that does not currently have a state Main Street center. And Grossmart RI, under the leadership of CJ, has been looking at the feasibility of establishing such a center. And if there were funding available for that kind of activity, that would make it a lot more feasible to launch. Let me now tell you just a little bit more about our panelists and turn it over to them, after which we will have Q&A and discussion involving as many of you folks as are interested in participating. And the full bios for each of these folks is available on our Summit webpage. First, it will be Paul Lowther. I already told you that he's the Executive Director of the Rhode Island Historic Preservation and Heritage Commission, and he's also what's known as our SHPO, our State Historic Preservation Officer. Paul's been in these posts for a couple of years, but he's been in the historic preservation field for a number of decades. One one of his other stints was as the chief of the National Register of Historic Places and National Historic Landmarks Program. He's a savvy advisor and partner for Grow Smart Rhode Island, and he's going to focus on the status of the Historic Tax Credit Program, evidence of the unmet demand for historic rehab, and how he sees historic rehab evolving in this somewhat dynamic, volatile, and uncertain environment that we're in. Next will be Hannah Moore, who, as I indicated, is Chief of Staff of the Executive Office of Commerce RI. She's my main go-to person at Commerce RI and always been very responsive and insightful. I've worked with Hannah on several initiatives, including making the Rebuild Rhode Island program more user-friendly for smaller projects. And Hannah also has an extensive background in brownfield redevelopment and is a great asset for our state. And another great asset for our state will be batting cleanup, and that's Barbara Sokoloff, who is one of the most accomplished and creative community development and redevelopment practitioners in Rhode Island and in the whole New England region. And Barbara's firm, Barbara Sokoloff and Associates, specializes in mixed use and community development, affordable housing development, and revitalization planning. Prior to starting her firm, Barbara had a number of leadership positions in the local community development field. And she's going to talk about how she's making historic rehab happen in a very resource-constrained environment, and talk about some of the tools beyond the tax credit and Rebuild RI that can be employed to make these projects feasible. So with that, Paul, I'm going to ask you to take the floor and then to have Hannah and Barbara follow. Thank you all very much. And Paul, take it away.
Scott, I think Paul has left the Zoom for some reason, so maybe we can skip ahead to Hannah for now and hope that he gets back in.
All right. We will improvise. That's what we're telling everybody is going to have to happen in order to get historic rehab done. So, Hannah, if you're okay, the floor is yours then.
Sure, great. Thanks everybody, and thanks Scott and CJ and John and everyone for the time today. I'm gonna pull up a couple slides and share a little bit about the Rebuild program and some of the recent changes that are helping get some historic projects done. So by way of background, the Rebuild Rhode Island Tax Credit Program was introduced in Rhode Island in 2015 as part of Governor Raimondo's suite of new economic development tools. So this brought a number of tools, including tax increment financing that allows us to use state tax increment financing to fill gaps in projects, as well as the Qualified Jobs Incentive Tax Credit Program, which helps unlock job creation either for companies in Rhode Island or helps us attract them from other places if they if the project wouldn't happen without the tax credits. So the Rebuild Rhode Island Tax Credit Program is really the workhorse real estate program. So this is in some ways it is a combination of, it is the state's de facto historic tax credit program at the moment for new projects. It is the let's figure out how to build new commercial space project, manufacturing projects. It does a lot of different things, and it has been, we've seen some really, really good success from the Rebuild program and also the whole suite of programs. So just to give you a bit of a sense, the total package here has supported about $2.4 billion of development in this time. And these are major new job creation projects. These are, I just did a quick tally. I think it's about 26 historic projects in that time. And I mean, dozens of other projects. So we've gotten a lot of projects through this program. And one other, and Scott mentioned the initiative that we're really grateful for GrowSmart partnership on, to try to make rebuild a little bit easier to use for historic tax credit projects, which would have been seeking state historic tax credits. So two General Assembly sessions ago, we were successful, thanks to the governor's leadership proposing in her budget, thanks to the General Assembly's partnership, and thanks to the advocacy of GrowSmart and many people on this call for advocating for expanding rebuild to make it to unlock some more historic projects. We were able to make a number of changes. So, for example, we were able to introduce what we've called a bit of a streamlined project process, where if you're seeking less than $1 million in tax credits, you can have a bit more of an expedited experience. So since we introduced that, we have seen 15 projects have gotten approved so far, and we've got really some exciting projects, and I'll tell you a little bit more about some of them shortly, but a number of them have been historic. We've also had a number of manufacturers, one manufacturer in a historic building. So it's been a really nice success, and it's I think sometimes the impact of these programs, when you start talking about dozens of projects, it gets lost because all of them are so impactful. I mean, and exactly for all the reasons Scott was explaining, everything from the revitalization of neighborhoods to cleaning up contamination to expanding job opportunities, and the list goes on and on and on. It's just really incredible. So just a couple of quick examples. So the first is Blount Fine Foods in Warren was able to access $1 million through the rebuild program for an expansion of its existing facility. And this is in a historic building, but it's also it was able to move relatively quickly to unlock this expansion. So while rebuild in some ways, it is a job creation program. It is kind of marrying manufacturing and historic projects in certain cases. And then another one, Strive Lofts, which if you've ever been on Atwells Avenue, if you've been near the new Gotham Greens facility, you probably have seen, and this is an example exactly as Scott was describing, where you've got a building that has been falling apart with contamination issues and vacant for I think about 2 decades. This project was able to go through our new rebuild streamlined process and access tax credits, and is well on its way. So we're very excited about this. This is in Providence, and I think that, Scott, I'm sure folks will have questions. You'll have questions about where things go from here with rebuild. We've seen a lot of good projects get underway and be completed thanks to the historic tax credit program, thanks to rebuild. And I think the real question is really, how do we keep it going? Because I mean, these are investments that are, these projects don't happen on their own without investment. So we are eager to see what's next. And I think these projects are so important. And rebuild has been a great tool. So I think we may get into this in some of the conversation about what happens next, but this is a little bit about rebuild and what's happened so far, and we're eager to see where things go from here.
Terrific. Thank you very much, Hannah. Paul is back with us. Paul had a little internet blip, but he's restored. just like he's trying to restore historic buildings, he's restored his connection. So Paul, take it away if you're ready. Well, you got to unmute yourself. Paul, I need to unmute yourself. unmute.
Yeah, sorry about that.
There we go.
Once I take my glasses off, I'm really hard to control. I'd like to start by just squelching a rumor that I've heard several times over the past couple of months, that there are no more buildings available in Rhode Island to use historic tax credits on. This is patently untrue. I can't speak to marketability, financing, and all those items, but I can tell you that the resource base in Rhode Island for buildings that could be rehabilitated, historic buildings, particularly industrial buildings, is still huge. Again, that's something that you should be aware of. I'd also like to make it clear that the Historical Commission, both federal and state, we don't select these projects. We have no function in that. Our job is to review them from a technical perspective to make sure that the work number one, complies with the Secretary's standards for rehabilitation, and number two, to try to act as a liaison and go-between between us on the federal side and the Park Service. I've heard people say, oh, the Park Service just approves what you approve. And the answer is no. We will go to bat for anybody who's an owner of property who's trying to do a rehab. If we think the work complies and the Park Service disagrees, we will argue the point. So be aware of that. So having said that, I'd like to briefly touch on the federal side, only because I think it illuminates a little bit on the state side and supports it. Recently, we've noticed a downtick in applications on the federal side, and I think that's true on the state side as well. But having said that, just to give you a sense of how important this program has been from the federal side, from 2015 to 2019, there were $452,593,418 worth of qualified rehabilitation expenditures in Rhode Island. Roughly 10% of those were completed, and the total value of federal tax credits in Rhode Island for last year alone was just about $9.5 million. Now, again, when we do these reviews, it's one standard does two things. One of the beauties of the federal tax credit program is if it is dovetailed with the state tax credit, it really helps the financing of the project. So I'm just going to briefly review the state tax credit history. Rhode Island established a tax credit program back in 2002, administered from the technical side by our agency. The program stimulated historic rehab activities across the state, usually in conjunction with federal tax credits, for 237 projects. That program, as Scott indicated, was suspended in 2008, was reinstated in 2013 to allocate unused tax credits from the prior program. There are a number of projects that are still in progress. We have 25 active projects still, and that's something that we're gradually beginning to close out on. We have active projects. We have 3 pending projects, which are fairly recent refunds using some money that was turned back to the tax credit program. There's 3 of those. Give you a little sense on Rhode Island's state tax credit. Over the life of the program, 315 projects or phases of projects were completed. Total investment was roughly $2 billion, 100 million in investment. The total tax credits were about 425 million. And part of those projects, they produced about 970, increased from 970 to 6,300 low-income housing units. Active projects, as I've indicated, there's about 25 of them now. The estimated investment from those projects alone is $219,471,665. Estimated aggregate tax credits on the state side for those projects still outstanding. It's about 47 million. As I say, the 25 projects in place. So there's still a lot going on. Now, several years ago, the historic tax credit program that's been tied with our agency and the Division of Taxation was not refunded. And actually, the program was sunsetted twice. It was not only sunsetted this year, but the previous year. And the intent on that, as expressed by the legislature, was to allow any unused funds to be reallocated and get those basically in the hopper. We certainly think that it's a good program. Having said that, and having been told by the administration that they did not intend to refund that program per se, we teamed with Rebuild Rhode Island for doing historic preservation tax credits. Last year in the General Assembly, there was a change in the provisions for the Rebuild program, which certainly made it easier to do smaller projects. I think there was a lot of support from Rebuild in terms of the historic building stock and using those projects as part of the Rebuild program. Funding was put aside to allow for that. And that's where we are now. We have relatively few projects that we know are going through that at this juncture, but that's starting to pick up. And we do know that for this program, if the project itself is $1 million or less than $1 million, there's actually an expedited application process for historic rehabs, which is a real plus because we tend to deal in that lower range very often for these projects. The proof is in the pudding and we'll see how it goes. We are very happy to be working with Rebuild to try to basically fill that important niche in that overall program. And again, this is the funding source that's available at this time. We do think that in the future, historic tax credits have a really important role overall in the recovery of Rhode Island economically. It's not a huge program, but it fills that important niche. And as Scott said, there are a lot of spin-off benefits beyond just the actual economic return to the state, both in terms of community development and quality of life. So that's essentially where we seem to be at this juncture. Generally, as I said before, there's been a downtick in terms of what we see as incoming projects. That's not unusual. These kinds of programs tend to ebb and flow over time, depending on what the market's like. And the market is not my expertise here, so I'll leave that to others to discuss. So.
Great. Thank you, Paul, very much. Barbara, your boots on the ground trying to make these projects happen. And so the floor is yours to tell us how you're managing and what you recommend.
Thank you, Scott. So let me share screen here. So thank you, and thank you, Paul, and thank you, Hannah. We are a community development, finance, and planning office. Besides myself, there's Derek Farias, who really understands all of this more than anyone, and Seth Sokoloff and Eric Watney. My background is actually as a city planner. My advanced degrees in planning, and I was city planner in Warwick. After regulating people and doing planning for a number of years, I really wanted to see how to make projects happen. And when I began the consulting business, it was a mix of planning as well as community development projects. But as time has gone on, that's really our focus. It's what we enjoy doing. On here, so, whoops. There we go.
Oh, there we go.
There we go. So the tools that we use, to do community revitalization projects and affordable housing, which is really very important to us, are the low-income housing tax credits, new market tax credits, state and federal historic tax credits, and we have used the Rebuild. All of these as financing tools, as well as, of course, many other sources. So looking at some of our projects that have been historic projects, just to give people a sense of the breadth of projects that have gone on in Rhode Island using the state historic tax credit. This is the Nonviolence Institute on Oxford Street in Providence, very much in the news These days, with everything going on with systemic racism, you know, the Nonviolence Institute is at the fore of that. And the investment, you know, through the state historic tax credit and new market tax credits enabled the Institute to have a face. The Dreyfus Building downtown, many of you are familiar with. It's affordable housing, but used new market tax credits for that, not low-income housing tax credits, and state and federal historic tax credits. The investor in this, interestingly, because I'll explain how the tax credits work on the new market side, is that we need to have an investor. And the investor here is the National Trust. And so, you know, we have worked very closely with the National Trust. A year ago, I was in Washington working with them and meeting with all of our delegation to lobby, my first time being in, you know, both of the houses of Congress, to actually lobby and meet with all of our legislators for more historic tax credits and more new market tax credits. The Mercantile, which was also done by AS 220, again, was new markets and state and federal historic tax credits. So you can see, you know, the impact of some of these projects and what's going on. Waterfire, and we'll talk more about Waterfire in a minute, but Waterfire, you know, was clearly a building from the 1920s that could only be done, you know, with these tools. Looking at the affordable housing, the Gately building was done by PCFD in Pawtucket. This was low-income housing tax credits, also a lot of scattered sites around it. This was a dilapidated building. I will say that most of our clients, but not all, are nonprofit developers because they can afford to take on these projects. They're not looking for the same rate of return for, you know, their own bottom line that a for-profit developer has to have. And so most of our affordable housing, not all, but certainly well over 90% of it, is with nonprofit developers. And the reason I mention that here is that it was the city of Pawtucket had it out to bid, and I will simply say that it was awarded, I think, 2 other times. They didn't want to give it to the nonprofit developer, PCDC at the time, but neither one of the for-profit developers were able to make it work. And so then the city came back to PCDC, and it's really a linchpin for, you know, what goes on in downtown Pawtucket, a really important piece. Another place that we have used the state historic tax credits very, if I could say liberally from the very beginning of the program, has been in the mill villages in Cumberland. This is Ashton Village, the most recent one that we did, but we did Lincoln Village, Woodwood, Berkeley, Main and Factory. So we did, you know, with Valley Affordable Housing, a nonprofit, hundreds of units. Interestingly, South Providence and the Elmwood Foundation and other areas, these were all done with state historic tax credits as well as low-income housing tax credits. The focus of Rhode Island Housing at that time under Richard Godfrey for focus areas really, and the combination with the state and federal historic tax credits, allowed a rejuvenation, a revitalization throughout South Providence of these beautiful historic structures that never would have happened, I really don't believe, without the focus from Rhode Island Housing and the state historic tax credit. Otherwise, they just would have gone the way you see most other inner cities. And so it's really very amazing, the restoration that has happened. Next is Prospect Heights. Now you can see how many sources went into this project by the number of people that are at the groundbreaking. So the Prospect Heights, interestingly, was, I think, the first or second public housing development in the country to receive federal historic tax credits. We worked very closely with the State Historic Preservation Commission to get this approved. We did not have, two things that we did not have here. One, well, three things really. The most advantageous tax credit is what's called a 9% credit and could give you up to 60% of your equity. This was the 4% credit and gives us probably 25% of our equity. So there were a lot of needs there. We were certain that we were going to have the state housing bond. There was a special bond of $10 million, and everyone thought that this was a poster child for the project. And lo and behold, it wasn't awarded. You never saw air go out of a room when we all got that telephone call. We then went to Rebuild, which was brand new. And Rebuild put into this project, and you can see the budget here, over $3 million. So this shows how Rebuild. Now, we also applied for state historic tax credits. And by the time, this project was ready, but we were not high enough, and we're still not there. I think we may be the next project coming, but mind you, this project is already, fully inhabited, and there were two other projects after this. So this is phase one of Prospect Heights. But this could not have gone forward at all if the Rebuild had not been there. We couldn't get the state historic tax credits at the time. We had the federal historic tax credits, and that was a real battle. But you see on this $12 million project that the Rebuild is just 25% of it, almost 20%, I guess. And so how important this was to that project. And I think it was one of the first big housing projects that Rebuild did, but it was really a savior for this project. And so it just shows that we couldn't get the state historic, and the state historic would have been at that time probably similar to the federal historic. So that would have, let's just say, $1.7 million. And the fact that we could bring in the Rebuild really made this project happen. And so that's clearly a tool there. So the next project that I want to show is the Waterfire Art Center. And I'm sure everyone's been familiar with it. And I bet if we had a show of hands, we'd see that many of our people, that are participating today have been there. So this was a building from the 1920s. You can see, here you can already see the new windows going in. It was not a mill building, I think like a warehouse building from American Locomotive. So there was a lot of work to be done here. Here you can see the finished product inside, and this is what we have today. And well, I shouldn't say that. This is what we had a year ago. With the project constantly, it's an art center, there are constant exhibitions going on there. There's reach out to the low income community. There's this terrace up on the top, very dynamic. And Waterfire wanted something to complement, the Waterfires downtown. They also moved their own offices and operations in there. And so the reality is today with the pandemic and without the, the opportunity to have all of these functions, it's very problematical, very challenging. So the Waterfire budget. This was a $14 million budget. And this project, like the Mercantile, like the Dreyfus, and like many of our other projects, Amos House, the Providence Public Library, has new market tax credits. We are also doing, well, I'll come to that when we talk about new markets. But so the credits here of the new markets, as you can see, are a significant piece. The federal historic tax credits are $1.6 million. The state historic tax credits, which came in toward the end of the project, we didn't expect it. And it came in at the end of the project, and items that we had to cut out and to scale back, we were able to add into the project. Now, what's very interesting is that if you look at the amount for the state historic tax credits and the federal historic tax credits, whereas in the past they had been more or less even, they were both at 20% credit. The state historic tax credit increased, so that was number one. And then B, as a nonprofit, we were able to do, the exchange, the credits. And I think that I'm just trying to think exactly, how we did that. But we were able to get, more funds coming into the project. And if Derek were here, he would give you the detail about that. But the way that the state historic tax credit and the exchange that we were able to do and didn't need to do a syndicator really allowed an increase in the state historic tax credit. In addition, we had the state cultural facilities bond, EPA brownfields cleanup, a LISC recoverable grant, and they still needed a capital campaign. So this was, obviously a very exciting project, but so is Prospect Heights, a very exciting project. And so in all of these, and it's what we like to do. So what are new market tax credits? Because that's really become the tool of the last 10 years. It's a federal tax credit. It encourages economic development in low-income communities. It's allocated by the Community Development Finance Institute to community development entities from the Treasury annually. A project, you have to tell, have a story for your project, and we get it in the project pipeline. What makes a project eligible for new markets? It has to be in a distressed census tract. It has to have a strong low-income community impact. It has to have readiness to proceed, and it has to be extremely competitive. So we have new markets projects that we're working on, outside of Rhode Island. The YWCA in Worcester is a $20 million project that's under construction. I will also say that also has state historic tax credits in it from Massachusetts and federal historic tax credits. We're working on a possible theater or some other use in Newburgh, New York. Again, it already has, it has the state historic tax credits have already been awarded and the federal historic tax credits. The third project that we're working on is we have one in Lynn that's under construction that decided not to go for the historic tax credits, but the projects that we work with that do not do that or do not have it have significant capital campaigns. So the Lynn project is under construction and had a successful capital campaign. Our project with a Boys and Girls Club. We're also doing a Boys and Girls Club in Lowell right now. And the challenge there is that they have an $8 million capital campaign need. And so what we're finding is that where there are not state or federal historic tax credits for one reason or another, because they don't exist, or the building may be historic but doesn't qualify, is that they have large capital campaigns. And in this pandemic, I will say that that's challenging. That it's really very, very difficult. Our project in Lowell, they have been waiting to meet with their major donor who they expect to give, a multi-million-dollar gift, but, they keep getting put off, so you begin to question it. So how does the new markets work? I'll just quickly tell you. It's a credit. It's based on sources. It provides 25% of the total project cost. There's a 7-year compliance period. There's high transaction costs, but it can be paired with historic credits, grants, etc. What I'll say is that on the water fire building, I'm in my office. I can't put my hand exactly right on it, but that project was one of the first projects that paired federal historic tax credits and new market tax credits, and was on the front page, the front cover of both the Journal of Tax Credits and then another national tax credit periodical. So it's a source, it's a major source, it's complicated, but what we have found is trying to balance all of these. When Prospect Heights, didn't have the state historics or the state housing bond, we were able to turn to the rebuild program. Where are we today? Well, to tell you the truth, we don't have at the moment in Rhode Island any historic projects. The Providence Public Library, which is just finishing and is new market tax credits, chose not to go the historic route, although Paul's agency certainly had review of it. And so clearly, if a project comes along without, that is eligible for new markets or for rebuild or housing bonds, that's our job. That's our challenge, is to try to put them together. But I will say that Rhode Island has less sources than our neighboring states, than Massachusetts or Connecticut or even New York. And we will do everything that we can to bolster these resources in Rhode Island. So that's our story.
A fascinating story, Barbara. A lot to learn and build on from that. Thank you all for excellent presentations. Answered a lot of questions, and your presentations raised some additional questions. I want to invite people in the audience to pose questions through the Q&A function. CJ, do you want to provide any additional guidance for people? Well, while we're waiting, Hannah indicates that she wants to make a few, to elaborate a little bit on what she had already said. So go ahead, Hannah.
If you don't mind, I think we hit thoroughly, I think, a lot of the good work that's going on with the rebuild program, but I'd like to add just a little bit of an update on kind of where things stand with the rebuild program. And I think, as Barbara illustrated very, very, very nicely, it does take a lot of different sources and sometimes weaving and kind of threading a lot of sources. So the rebuild program is, and for those of you who are familiar with it, it was a capped program. So we are limited, we're down to about 10, 13, it's like in that $1 million, it's like $10 to $15 million range left under the program cap. And as I explained at the top, this is the program that does a lot of different things, everything from unlocking new developments at Quonset to unlocking beautiful historic redevelopments. So it's got a lot of demands on it, and there's not a lot of capacity left in the program. So there is a budget proposal to increase the cap, but that is, so doing a lot more rebuild requires some more investment. And so that's the first thing on rebuild. I also want to note that the tax increment financing program that we have is not capped. So that is another option that a number of the historic projects have used. So if there's a use that's going into the project that will generate a new state tax stream, that can be an option that the Commerce team would be very happy to talk through with folks. The qualified jobs.
That's been used for several hotel projects in particular.
It has, yeah. So maybe a nice historic example would be the Hotel Beatrice that Joe Paolino is working on downtown. That uses primarily the tax increment financing tool. So if you've got, a project that's got a new restaurant or a hotel, those are often good fits for the tax increment financing tool. The qualified jobs incentive tax credit tool can also help with historic projects if you're trying to to attract a tenant. So, as an example, the 75 Fountain project downtown Providence, which is a beautiful historic building, it has successfully used the qualified jobs incentive tax credit to help unlock Emphasis landing in that building, to unlock GE Digital landing in that building. So those are a couple of examples. And Barbara raised the affordable housing bond projects. That's another key source that goes into a lot of these projects. And the bonds that have been approved by the voters so far are fully tapped out. And there is currently a $65 million bond proposal in the current proposal from the governor that would go $45 million for affordable housing and then $20 million for community infrastructure. So the key question now is what the pathway is to getting it on the ballot and getting it approved by the voters. So that's a question we're eager to see the answer to, and but that would be a significant increase over what we've seen in the last few years from that source. So in 2016, we had a $50 million bond proposal, $10 million for blight remediation, $40 million for affordable housing, and we are aiming to spend down this bond obligation in 2 years instead of 4 years. So we're hoping to really put that money on the street as quickly as we can once we get it approved. That being a key step here. The community infrastructure piece is a new item in the bond budget that I think will play a key role for historic projects and for a number of different projects. It is kind of a mashing together of a lot of these projects are often hard to fill gap. We're trying to figure out, does this source work? Does this source work? And this is an amalgamation of the community infrastructure program that this group has done great work advocating for, as well as thinking about the Main Street revitalization program that Commerce has run for a number of years and hasn't had funding for in the last couple. That is, so we're thinking that can be used to fill gaps in things like if you're aiming to put a grocery store in a project. I think it will pair very nicely with New Markets tax credits, and it's assuming we can get it to come to fruition. And then also thinking about projects that really have an emphasis on community health as well. So just the emphasis on walkability, the emphasis on the role that all of these projects play in healthy communities, especially at a moment where a lot of our communities have been particularly hard hit by COVID. So that's one big item in the works, and we will eagerly wait to see the outcome on that. And then the other note I would make is in the governor's budget proposal, there's also the sustainable funding stream for affordable housing that would be in the mix here. So we would be aiming to have something that we can count on year after year, rather than it having to go back and forth to the voters for approval. So those are a couple of sources that we definitely have our eye on and are hoping we see come to fruition. So
thank you. Yeah, the need for more affordable housing opportunities and investment is, I think, very clear, and we are strongly supportive of the governor's efforts and others to get more funding in the pipeline for that. And that actually leads to a question. One of the critiques in the past by some of the state historic tax credit was that a majority of the funds from the credit were being used for residential development versus commercial development. And I always thought that was a short-sighted critique. that was sort of based on the notion that residential development does not relate to economic development, which I think is really a faulty assumption. But now we're in a new era, at least for a while, we're in a new era in which I think it's arguable that the demand for commercial development, at least office space, is going to decline. And at the same time, we have a clear and urgent need for more housing supply in our state. One estimate is we should be producing 3 times annually the number of housing units that we currently produce. So given all of that, I'm wondering if the past reticence of the legislature and of others to promote rehab that involves residential development is going to abate, and we're going to see more support for residential development through state funding sources. And I'm wondering what you folks think about that. Am I dreaming? Am I groping? Am I grasping? Or is there something here? Paul?
Yeah, we're not the experts, but from my perspective, and I think the preservation constituency, development is development. You can't have commercial development without people to go to do the commerce. And now, having gone through this COVID crisis, one wonders, with all the people that have wound up having to work from home, whether or not that will be another factor that will contribute to that. But it's kind of like saying, you know, you're going to go out and play basketball with one hand. No, use two, and the two go together, and they complement each other. At least that's our perspective. Sure. And I think that is a perspective which is shared by the federal tax program.
Sure, and I know a lot of historic rehab developments are mixed use. They're a combination of commercial and residential, and that's a dynamic mix often. Other thoughts, Hannah?
Yeah, I will add a couple of points. One is that I think there are fundamental tax reasons why the state is always going to be, when we're thinking about state investments, the tax streams that come through the state are often, very, very heavily weighted towards jobs.
Right.
And the income tax, sales tax, those types of revenue streams that I think there is some inherent just math to the state's emphasis on commercial development versus residential development, even as it embraces everything Paul just said, and that all of us would pile on with.
Yeah, I think one of the things we've been frustrated with, and it's not just in the Raimondo administration, it predates the Raimondo administration, is the notion that if a historic rehab project is particularly beneficial to the municipal government's fiscal situation, that's almost irrelevant to the state's well-being. And I would argue, and I'm not saying you say that.
Oh, no.
There are some people who have sort of made this artificial distinction between what's good for the city's coffers and what's good for the state's coffers. And I argue that a number of the municipalities that are in most dire fiscal straits are going to become the responsibility increasingly of the state unless the state helps them generate more revenue. And a lot of that, and the cities are really indifferent, I would say, from a fiscal standpoint as to whether the redevelopment is residential or commercial, because they're looking at ratables. They're looking at putting a property back fully on the tax rolls and generating income from that property. And so I think there's often been a disconnect between the state and municipalities as to what is optimum economic development. And part of that is because of the way revenues are generated for cities versus the state. And it's a problem not only in terms of this issue, but in terms of other issues like school financing.
Yeah, and I think that's exact. I mean, in some ways, thinking about the role of the municipalities was exactly where I was going to go. Is I think that we've got some really dynamic and fantastic municipal leaders who are figuring out how to get projects done, and I think that that advocacy is invaluable. And I think that, so I do think that the municipalities absolutely play a very, very, very fundamental role in advocating for residential development and resources to unlock development and improvements in our communities. And so I think that's the first thing I want to say. The second thing I want to say is that thinking about municipal tools and what municipalities have by way of the municipal tax increment financing as an example, I think is just another example of, I think sometimes when state tools don't exist, we do have to, as Barbara really beautifully articulated, getting creative and figuring out ways to create sources that can get projects done. And there may be other examples, and I know some of the municipalities are indeed doing exactly that, but I would just throw that out there as an idea.
So Hannah and others on the panel, what can we as a pro-historic rehab community, what arguments can we make, what actions can we take to have the General Assembly look more favorably on renewing or expanding the cap, getting more funds into the Rebuild Rhode Island program? Because it is, in many ways, at least for future projects, right now the only show in town for historic rehab facilitated by the state. So what are your thoughts? There's a $22 million ask, I believe, for additional funding of rebuild. Is that right?
I believe it's another $40 million on the cap. The budget math is a little different.
Yeah, but I think when you net it out, when there's some other thing that makes the real number, I think, closer to, but anyway, it's tens of millions of dollars. And it doesn't seem like that's going, it seems like that may not be going anywhere unless there's some change in the political and policy dynamic.
So I would comment. I think the problem is that Rhode Island thinks small, and particularly, as we work in other states and we see the other resources, we say, why not here? And did 38 studios have to have such a negative impact? Well, it probably did, because it was inappropriate and out of proportion to what should have been done. And so from my perspective, it's a broader issue of almost the psychology of the state. Mm-hmm. And how do we begin to think bigger and to think differently and to recognize that it's not project by project. It isn't that this project is good and that project is good. It's that historic rehabilitation is good, affordable housing is good, and that in order to keep the state financially healthy and to keep it develop, investment to keep coming in here, that it's important that we get a different psychology about this. And I'm not sure how to go about that, or how we, as advocates, can go about getting the state to think differently. But it's almost like we need a vision. And I'm going back to my planning, jargon here. But we need a visioning for what we want the state to be, and how do we get there, and what are the tools that we need to make that happen. And to have the heads from the General Assembly and the governor all together, in a room doing this visioning, so that it's a collaborative visioning for, how do we move the state forward, and what are the actions that we need to take? I think we need that bigger picture.
And I do think I want to give credit where credit is due, and there is a lot of credit due to the Raimondo administration and Commerce RI on some aspects of this. I think Rhode Island now is one of the few places in America where there's a state TIF based on generating state sales and income tax revenue. So I think that's a creative, bold move. I think the current proposal to put $65 million on the table through a bond for housing and community infrastructure is stepping up the stakes and the ask from what it was just 6 or 9 months ago. So I want to give credit for that. And I've been a student of Rhode Island's self-esteem issues and kind of the gap between our huge potential and our sometimes Mets performance. But I think I don't think sometimes we do think big. I mean, we moved rivers, we moved train tracks, we moved highways to make Providence a very different place than it was when I was growing up. And people from all over the country and the world actually come to Providence to study the Providence Renaissance. So I think there are times when the stars are aligned correctly, when we actually do very impressive and very innovative things. But then I think sometimes we fall back into our self-loathing and self-flagellation, and that, I think I don't know. I don't have a full answer to it, but I actually feel we're making some progress on that front. I think one of the key areas of disappointment for me is that we are not gaining population, in part because we have not done enough to promote the advantages of housing. And we're right on the cusp of losing a congressional seat. And I would attribute it in part to very narrow, short-sighted approaches in some municipalities, and not enough push maybe from the state to promote much more housing production. And that's going to be a real economic drain if we, from a standpoint of federal resources, if we continue to stagnate in terms of I'm not saying we should grow like Texas or Arizona. That's unrealistic and not good for a state as resource constrained as many natural resources. But there's got to be some, I think, acknowledgement that we've got to figure out how to find the balance between growth and preservation, and that there is a way to do both and have each benefit each other rather than have them be at odds with each other.
Yeah, so. I think that in this particular year, knowing how cost constrained we are and just the fiscal realities, I think it is unbelievable the amount of federal resources that these projects are unlocking. And I think that is going to be, that like those kinds of arguments that if we invest, we're able to pour investment from so many other places, is a key argument that we should lean into in this year. And in addition to every other argument about all the benefits and just how many projects in so many areas of the state these projects have. So.
Another point I want to make is that when the state historic tax credit program was in its salad days in the early 2000s, I was getting calls from all over the country to go to national conferences to speak about the Rhode Island program, because the Rhode Island program, when it in its first 4 or 5 years, was viewed as the most ambitious and most successful state historic tax credit program in the country. So again, that's a case where we acted aggressively, ambitiously, put a lot of money into a program, got a national reputation, and then we got cold feet and we pulled back. A former governor, whom I liked a lot, but whom I disagreed with on some things, said the program was too successful. And that was the reason why it was pulled back.
Scott, remembering back to those days, I remember being at a conference and somebody talking about the tax credit program in Rhode Island. You know what they said? Rhode Island, the little engine that could.
Say it again. Now they said what?
The little engine that could.
Yeah.
And I think that's part of the issue, that we have a tendency, all of us, to get, we don't intend to be, siloed or anything, but we have a tendency to look everything at a micro view as opposed to a macro. And the two have to be going hand to hand together to really reach that success. I'll give you an example that's related to preservation: climate change. What's going on? coordination, at least in my view. The same is true with a lot of these. All of these different programs, these different tools are great. And as Barbara's noted, you know, you can combine the financial tools and whatnot, but you also need the overarching mechanism of a good solid plan or idea of where you're trying to get to when you put all those pieces together and other pieces that go
Well,
in.
that's true. And we do have centers of and niches of excellence. You just mentioned climate change. My understanding is that the studies and projections on sea level rise that Rhode Island has done through the CRMC and others are probably the most sophisticated of any state in the country. And
Right.
the mapping, the coastal mapping we did of offshore area that has facilitated offshore wind development was one of the most innovative approaches of any state in the country. So again, we have, you know, what I want to make clear to everybody listening is while we do have this self-esteem problem and this notion of thinking small sometimes, we have demonstrated the capacity to be a national leader, and we need to nurture that and encourage more of that and encourage these little pockets of excellence to be integrated into a bigger, bolder plan, as you mentioned, Paul.
I think Rhode Island being small is not a disadvantage, it's an advantage.
Yeah.
And we
Yeah.
need to, and there have been moments in the past, as you've noted, where Rhode Island has grasped that notion and moved it.
Yeah.
And I think that, you know, we're ripe to do that again, frankly.
Yeah. Well, let's hope so. And I think with that, while I had more questions and thoughts, it is a little bit past our scheduled closing time, and I think we've ended on hopefully a visionary and encouraging note. I want to thank all of you very much for excellent perspective and the excellent work you do day to day. And I want to encourage everybody listening to keep involved in this issue and the broader issues of community and economic development. And let's be creative, let's be innovative, let's be aggressive, and let's make sure better days are still ahead of us. I think they can be and will be. And as CJ indicated, we will not have a webinar next week, but we'll be back 2 weeks from today. And look forward to also seeing many of you at our half-day summit plenary, virtual summit plenary on September 25th. So thanks a lot.
Thank you all.
Appreciate it.